Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of What Is This Weapon? My name is Joe, I'm one of the Curatorial Assistants here at the Royal Armouries, and I'm back with another weird family of machine guns. What have I got in front of me? Well, this is a Beardmore-Farquhar machine gun, and if the name sounds familiar, or part of the name sounds familiar, and indeed parts of this gun look familiar, you might know its relative, the Farquhar Hill self-loading rifle, which saw brief adoption with the British Armed Forces during the First World War. This shares a lot of the principles of that design. You've got the main one being a gas piston at the front, which is actually not connected directly to the working parts here at the rear. There's an intermediary spring system. The whole purpose of this is to basically iron out any inconsistencies in the pressure of ammunition. Ideally, it should recoil the same every time and maybe lead to a softer shooting gun as well. That's the idea. The main inventor behind this is Mowbray Gore-Farquhar, wonderful name, and he was a colonel in the British Army, saw service in South Africa, and mainly did a lot of tinkering in the early 1900s with Arthur H. Hill, a gunmaker from Birmingham. They worked together on a lot of patents, their most well known being the aforementioned self-loading rifle. And this machine gun was developed concurrently with that rifle. It was first unveiled for testing in 1916, underwent a series of tests throughout the 1920s, and was last seen in the 1930s. That's the full lifespan of this rifle, really. Why did he come up with it? In essence, this is marketed as a direct competition to the Lewis gun that had just been introduced in British service in 1915, and been around a few years before that as well. Perhaps Farquhar heard some of the complaints, or maybe just the general characteristics of the Lewis gun, and thought he could create an alternative. Some of the things the Lewis gun was known for, outside of its combat effectiveness, was of course its weight and also its cost. There are a few instances where Farquhar takes direct shots at the Lewis gun in some aspects of its design. For example, when he comes up with this pan magazine, he says it's so much more simple because it means the gun doesn't have to use the pull system that the Lewis gun does to rotate the magazine. But there are a few implied swipes as well. The first few lines, in fact, of his manual are, it is the lightest machine gun, it is the cheapest machine gun, it's the cheapest to manufacture and uses less spares than any other machine gun. So it's pretty clear who he's aiming at there. To create this gun, he enlists the Beardmore & Co. company from Glasgow, Clydeside area. They're mainly known for locomotives, ships, even making some aircraft as well. They do have a contract during the First World War to repair and create howitzers, but they don't really have any small arms experience at this point. So a bit of a questionable choice of manufacturer, and that does indeed have an effect on these things later on. As I mentioned, the first test of these was in 1916. There is then another round of testing in 1918 and 1919, a trial that it takes part in 1921, and another test in 1924, and finally a last demonstration in 1931, and that's the last that ever really heard of in a military context. So how do these guns fit into the tests? We've got gun numbers 12, which we'll have a look at later. This one here is gun number 17, and the one at the very front there is serial number 44. The first two are Mark 1s, and the one with the synchronizer gear there is a Mark 2 improved. However, those aren't really hard and fast distinctions. There's lots of different details between all of them, and it seems that there are modifications constantly between each production example. Almost everyone tested seems to be at least a little bit different. So it's quite hard to pin them down in that respect. We do know that these versions, these Mark 1s, are still drastically different from what was initially shown in 1916. We don't actually know what the 1916 one looks like definitively. There's no pictures provided or anything like that. But from the 1919 tests, we can reverse engineer what it looked like. They compare the two quite closely, and so we get a lot of its features from the 1919 test. We are missing the actual reports from 1916, which is a shame. So we've got to kind of piece together some details there. A lot of the information I'm using here comes from the Small Arms Committee, which was responsible for a lot of the testing. So if you hear me say SAC, I'm referring to those guys. And they've got a wealth of material on all of these guns. And the bulk of what we know about them comes from there, I believe. So 1916, as I say, the first test, this looks wildly different. In fact, it looks a lot closer to the self-loading rifle that you might be more familiar with. You may perhaps recognise that this is feeding from the top from a pan magazine, and the body at the back is flipped upside down compared to the rifle. In 1916, this wasn't the case. It was a lot more conventional layout, but it was also turret mounted. That meant no bipod, no stock mounted at the back here, and even things like the springs, the main springs in here. At the moment, in these newer versions, we've got a spring inside another spring, so in line. We had pairs of springs mounted side by side. And this pan magazine, as I say, didn't exist. In fact, it was an enlarged version of the rifle magazine, that conical drum magazine that held 65 rounds. That sounds like a monster. After this initial testing, we don't know what the specific complaints are. We don't have any of the reports, as I say, but we do know they had about half a dozen major issues with it, including its suitability for ground use, him submitting a turret-mounted version. By 1919, he's come up with a new model and proposes that for testing as well. And we know that that one looks a lot more like the version we see here. There's a preliminary test, in fact, slightly before that, in June 1918, which he tinkers with to make the model 1919. However, I'm just going to read from a quote here, the letter he receives in March 1919. With reference to the Beardmore-Farquhar machine gun, I have to inform you there's no prospect of a new machine gun entering into service. However, if you'd still like to show us your new machine gun, we would be very happy for you to arrange for us to do so. A huge rebuttal, and this is really the crux of Farquhar's problem here. Even if this was a brilliant design, and there's no guarantee that it is, by the time it comes to an improved version in 1919, the war's ended. Most major military is actually looking to get rid of surplus weapons rather than take a chance on acquiring a new, untested one. So he really is up against it there. Despite that though, the tests go ahead in April and it's quite well received. It's quite a smooth test. The Small Arms Committee say it's a distinct improvement on earlier models. Their only quibbles are really with some of the marketing guff. They do take issue with it being the lightest, with it being marketed as the cheapest, for example. They say that's open for debate, which is fair enough. That seems pretty open and shut, but less than 2 years later, in 1921, the Small Arms Committee have changed their minds. Actually, they do want to explore lighter options for machine guns. So they start a trial to compare some examples and see what they like. So I can imagine Farquhar's surprise at his Beardmore-Farquhar being included in this trial. Some of the other competitors include, well, a D-type Lewis gun. That's a lightened version without the cooling fins and jacket. A Hotchkiss, 2 versions of that, both strip-fed and magazine-fed. There is a Madsen involved, and finally a BAR in 303 as well. So all the great and good of that post-First World War era there. I think that trial actually might warrant a video itself. It's really fascinating finding out how they all performed in the tests and who the Small Arms Committee really liked as a result of that. Spoiler alert, it's the BAR. It's not the Beardmore-Farquhar. This performs worst or nearly worst in basically every test, I'm afraid to say, in that 1921 trial. I made the notes of some of the many complaints that were aimed at this as a result of that trial. We have its poor accuracy with a hot barrel, and after some endurance tests, poor accuracy in general, by far and away the worst of any of them. Obviously that points to a poor construction quality of the barrel itself, poor metallurgy. It eroded very quickly and couldn't withstand heat very well. It was excessively prone to stoppages, especially when there was any dirt, muck, mud, sand, anything in the system. It really didn't like it. It had a poor magazine, which increased the number of stoppages, and those stoppages were incredibly hard to clear as well, some of them taking up to 10 minutes to clear, which seems well, it seems like madness, but when we have a look at the internal mechanism of this, I'll explain a bit more about why some of those stoppages were difficult to clear. They thought it was difficult to clean as well. They thought it was difficult to teach people how to use, and they didn't think it'd be able to put into production very quickly or easily either. So a laundry list of complaints when this thing was really put through its paces. They are very stringent tests, I will say that. A lot of the guns struggled in a lot of the tests, but this one especially so. The only caveat they give to the Beardmore-Farquhar is that it's a recent design with new manufacturers. They have had little to no experience with putting it through service conditions. That's almost directly what they said. So that's a little caveat there for the Beardmore-Farquhar. It next appears in 1923 and 1924 when Farquhar has gone away, taken some of this on board and come back with a new design identical to this, the model of 1923 and then model of 1924. Slight differences between them, but it's the model of 1924 that gets tested. And before we launch into that, we'll take one of these apart. We'll have a look at some of the things that he's improved and some of the things which still go wrong in this design. So I'll reappear with number 12, which comes apart nice and easily. Okay, so we're back with gun number 12. This one comes apart a lot easier. So we'll use this one, but as I say, it's functionally identical to number 17. This is the version that was produced in around about 1923. So still a ways to go in its improvement, but this is a pretty standard example for the time. Going to start by removing the magazine. There's a little sprung tab on the top here, which allows us to rotate and then lift the magazine off the spindle. This magazine is not original to the gun. This is a slightly later design, indicated by this little stop here, which is a visual indicator for how many rounds are left in the magazine. If I turn the magazine over, it reveals one of the big problems of this design, and that is, you might notice there's no feed lips built into this magazine here. If it wasn't for this catch, there'd be nothing holding the rounds in. So by adding this, they've of course added an extra step involved in loading and unloading the gun. When you apply the magazine, you have to remember to take the catch off, otherwise it's not going to feed any rounds. And similarly, if you're unloading a partially loaded magazine, you have to remember to apply the catch again, because if you take this off with the catch open, all the rounds in there are going to spurt everywhere. Up to 80 of them, or 81 of them. So not a good idea, really. An extra step adding this catch. What's also a problem of this feed system is with the feed block in here being built into the rifle, if you get any kind of stoppages or jams, then you have to physically force the rounds back into the magazine to apply the catch. When I said there were up to 10 minutes for some of these stoppages, this is why. Whenever they got it open and tried to clear a jam or anything, more rounds are being fed into the problem from the magazine. It was a real nightmare in that respect. Because this also feeds straight down, there's not that much support for the rounds. There'll be a lot of double feeds or rounds dropping too early. There are even, in some cases, examples of the round being chambered, being followed immediately by another round, which was having the nose of its bullet pressed into the primer. I didn't hear of any discharges happening that way, but it's certainly a risky proposition. So not a great deal of help and reliability coming from this feed system. The reason why I designed it this way, because he reckoned it would be the lightest and simplest way to do it, which is correct, but it did introduce a host of other problems as well. So there is a little bit of problem with the magazine there. It also took them a while to add in things like this, what they call the dummy round, the follower there as well. So it took a bit of tinkering to even get to that point. So pop that over there. The magazine looked at. We're now going to start this end. We'll have a look at its kind of distinct method of operation here and see what else we can find out. Got to remove this pin at the front here, and that allows us to remove this band, which will come apart in multiple pieces as soon as I lift it off the bipod here. So be sure to catch all of those. This band and space will become one part in later versions. From there, we can unscrew the gas regulator and gas tube, like so. And that brings with it a little tiny gas piston here, which we can remove like so. Comes with its own little spacer. You can see the incredibly small gas piston, really short length of travel. We'll have a look at why that is in just a second. So this is the mainspring cover. You can also remove the mainspring. 2 mainsprings, in fact, one inside the other. And now I've got to disconnect this recoil spring. It's currently under tension, so I've got to work out a way to disconnect it without sending it flying across the store. And there we go. That just directly clips into the bolt carrier there and unclasps with this little catch. So this is the spring assembly all laid out. You can take these little sheaths off here. And you can see that one on this side has revealed a really important part of the design. What we also have in here is a small plunger. So how does this thing operate? Let's clear some of these parts away. Have a look. So naturally, as the round is fired, the bullet makes its way along the barrel, followed by the gas, which then siphoned off into this gas block here, and that acts along the end of this piston, pushing it along this channel here. That pushes this plunger in front of it and crucially starts compressing the mainspring. The other end of the mainspring is being compressed by the return spring here. As the piston reaches the full length of its travel, you can see it hits the spring on this catch, which then closes shut. That traps this piston in place, essentially forming the end of this tube into a solid wall, which means when the mainspring needs to decompress, wants to exert that force, you can only do it one way, towards the rear. It will then overcome the pressure of the return spring, the press force of the return spring, and push that back, cycling the bolt. As soon as the gas pressure is relieved, then the spring compresses itself and pushes everything forward, releasing the plunger and the pressure on that. So that's essentially how it works. It uses the gas to compress a spring rather than directly work on the parts, which means that the only force cycling that is that spring pressure each time. So it should, in theory, be identical no matter the pressure of the round. That's in theory. In practice, we can see there are many, many small parts of this, including thin elements. The recoil spring is this rod, a spring, and this tube that goes inside the mainspring. So it was a common complaint that these parts will get damaged and broken quite often and just impede the entire functioning of the gun. The mainspring in some tests broke into as many as 5 pieces. I know springs do have a tendency to break, but that is still quite alarming at the frequency in which breakages like that happened. If this rod bent, the whole system was out of whack. If anything struck this tube, although it does have some protection from this bipod bar here, it's certainly not damage proof, and any dents would affect that as well. So yeah, lots of teething problems there, certainly. The problem as well with storing this energy up with the recoil energy is when they got to mud tests and things like that, there'd often be times where the gun would jam, and when the person tried to clear the stoppage after a fired round, as soon as they touched this bolt carrier, then they'd disturb the spring would release, and it would extract and eject minutes or even seconds after firing, which did result in injury in a few cases when people had their hands around the parts as they cycled. So definitely a few teething troubles with this system, absolutely. As we move further back, we're going to remove this trigger bar, and the trigger and the bipod bar are all held on the crosshead here. So I'm just going to have to remove this pin as well, lift it up slightly just to take the weight off it. So that's the pin out, and with it comes Farquhar's patented bipod. And with the front part, the trigger guard out, or trigger bar out, we can then remove this pin at the back here. It's got a little spring tab on this side, which we can then depress and push through. When we pull that out, that allows us to remove the pistol grip, the trigger bar, etc. The bit I want to point out on this, the detail, is this sear at the top here. When I pull the trigger, you can see that's depressed. This should, in most cases, fire from an open bolt. And this sear catches this lug on the rear of the bolt carrier, holding it to the rear. When you pull the trigger, of course, that releases it, it flies forward, chambers around, fires. The problem is, if you had any kind of friction in the system caused by, I say, mud, dirt, an ingress of anything like that, or if the springs were worn, or if there was a particularly underpowered round which didn't get the right compression in the springs that you'd like, then often the bolt would either fail to get to the rear and therefore not lock on the sear, or it would get to the rear and not have the force to compress these little spring buffers at the back here, and therefore chamber another round, maybe not fire it, but chamber another round without you necessarily intending to. This is also highly dependent on trigger control as well. If you, of course, even in semi-automatic, if you kept the trigger held, then it would fire, the next shot will fire from a closed bolt, as there's nothing to catch it here. Alternatively, if you snatched at the trigger, then it would always catch. So your firing mode would depend basically on a few factors. There's not much consistency in the shooting as well, which was another thing which was picked up. So that's one problem. So the trigger operates that sear. The trigger also operates the rest of the trigger mechanism in this box here and drops the hammer. It does this in a, via a trigger bar, which moves up here. In fact, if I take the top plates off here, I can show you in a bit more detail. I'm going to need the nose of a bullet to push in the retaining tab on this plate. Then I can pull that off to the rear, like so. You don't have to remove the rear sights, but I will, because that screw isn't retained and they tend to fall off anyway when I'm doing this. And the bit of elbow grease should be able to take off that top plate as well, which is quite stiff. So that reveals the top of the trigger mechanism here. And what we're looking at is the top of the trigger bar, which will pull back on this hook attached to a sear, which is in turn holding the hammer up. When the trigger bar is pulled to the rear, the hook pulls the sear rearwards and drops the hammer. The selector is this lever here. Might be quite hard to see in this orientation, or indeed without it actually in operation, without the pressure of the trigger there. But this rotates a half moon pin. It's got a flat side and a rounded side. The flat side, when that's engaged with the hook, is the automatic setting. That means the hook remains in engagement with the sear the full length of its travel. So as long as you hold the trigger down, it pulls the sear rearwards and it won't interfere with the hammer. On the half moon side, the semi-automatic side, at that hook's rearwardmost part of its travel, it will lift, disengage from the sear, allowing that sear to fly back forwards and engage the hammer before the next shot. So that's one thing the trigger operates, but we also have yet another sear here. This is actuated externally by this piece here. And you'll notice that it's actually interacted with by that extension on the end of the bolt carrier. This out in semi-automatic is now to battery safety. That means the hammer won't drop until it's fully in battery. This interfaces with a cutout in the hammer. You can see there's just a slight cutout there on the downward side as you're looking at it. So yeah, it won't fire in either mode unless that's there. If this is in automatic, then of course, if the trigger's being held, the sear at the rear isn't holding the hammer, so the hammer only fires when it gets to the front, the hammer drops, and then the cycle rinses and repeats. So the only thing holding the hammer in automatic is this sear at the rear. Just have a look at the things going on inside here. You're just going to have to disconnect the trigger groups to take the body cap off at the back here. Just going to have to grab that little plate with some pliers and disconnect it from the trigger bar. There you go, so that's out of there. Now, put that trigger bar to the rear. I should be able to rotate the interrupted thread in the body cap and take off the stock. And you can see the little spring buffers there. And that should allow us to slide the bolt and bolt carrier off the rear of the gun. This comes with a couple of extra little dust plates as well, dust cover plates. So starting with the bolt carrier, you can see it's quite a distinctive component, this rounded shape with the two cocking handles, and you can quite clearly see in there the curved cam groove which rotates and locks the bolt. And again, that's the little extension on the bolt carrier which interfaces that external sear. The bolt itself is nothing too unusual, there's nothing revolutionary here. You can see a big Mauser style extractor claw, very simple rotating locking mechanism, two locking lugs at the front, and another outer battery safety here with the firing pin. So the firing pin travels through here and has this lug. You can see it cannot move forward with the bolt unlocked. However, when it rotates into its locked position, you can see it lines up with this recess here, allowing the firing pin to come forward and protrude onto the bolt face. You've got a little sprung extractor there, but one element of this design here is this thin metal lip designed to support the rim of the 303 cartridge. Lots of reports of this rim breaking or chipping or warping, often just bits fracturing off, and that of course leads to more feed issues as it's not really supporting the rounds properly as it goes in. So it's already unreliable feed, becomes even worse when these things break. So a bit of a metallurgical problem there. So that's this thing stripped as much as we're going to want to do that today. Some of these other parts do come off, but it's not really too much more interesting to look at. But what we can see here really is a perfect storm of design and manufacture intersecting to create problems. Some of these parts are designed to be thin and light and small, which reduces weight, but coupled with poor manufacturing quality in a lot of them, then that means that you get parts which are very liable to warp, distort, bend, break, and overall negatively impact the gun. And this is exactly what was found in those 1921 trials, and even later, as we're about to see. We'll pick up where these left off. We'll come back to the 1924 test as this thing magically reassembles itself. So with this thing magically back together, what happens next? Well, it's those tests in 1924 that I mentioned, in which 5 guns, serial numbers 39 through 43, are tested at Hythe by the Chief Inspector of Small Arms there. And suffice to say, the model of 1924 guns do not impress any more than the others. In their report, they're said to be unpleasant to shoot and to use, even for highly trained men. And in this final report, I'm just going to read a bit of a direct quote here. The design of the gun has been improved in several respects. There remain, however, a number of details which cannot be looked at as satisfactory from a service point of view. Chief amongst these is the principle of operation of the mechanism contained within the mainspring tube, which is the main feature of the invention. That's a bit of a bummer for Farquhar, as you can imagine. They've decided that no matter what he does to this gun, they just don't like it. There's nothing here which will impress them, basically. And that sentiment is echoed by the Small Arms Committee in their addendum to this report, where they say, in view of the consistent failure of these guns, we consider this design to be incapable of being modified into a satisfactory weapon. And that should be the end of the story. However, it isn't. In 1926, the Beardmore Company creates the Beardmore 26 Fighter, a 2-seater fighter, which comes armed with 2 synchronized versions of the Beardmore-Farquhar in the nose and 1 in a turret ring mount behind the pilot. This plane's tested by Latvia. They don't like it, so that doesn't go anywhere. And then we get to these things' final appearance in 1931, where Farquhar again arranges a demonstration of some updated models. 4 guns are demonstrated, or shown rather. We have an improved ground-mounted ground version of the machine gun. We have a high RPM variant of the machine gun. We have a 50 cal version being demonstrated as well, which he has been trying to peddle since 1919. It certainly showed up in that manual, marketed as a light anti-tank machine gun. And we also have a version with a synchronized synchronizer gear attached. I'd love to think that it was this gun on the table in front of me. As we know, serial number 43 was tested in 1924, and it'd be amazing if the next time we see it, it's serial number 44 with the synchronizer gear. That's a bit of conjecture. It'd be a nice part of the story, but I'm not going to say that's true. All but the synchronizer gear gun was shot at this demonstration, and well, I'll let the Small Arms Committee speak for themselves again. The improvements are not such that the failings of earlier models have been eradicated, and finally, no further actions should be taken with this weapon, essentially killing the Beardmore-Farquhar, certainly in relation to the British, to entering British service. And that's the entire story of the Beardmore-Farquhar. Nearly 20 years of tinkering and testing, unfortunately didn't really lead anywhere. Unfortunately, I think this design was too little too late. It was always lagging behind contemporary designs. It never really had the impetus to leapfrog them and become the preferred option. It was never going to oust tried and tested designs from tried and tested manufacturers, unfortunately. Its earlier competition, the Lewis gun, it failed against, and by the time it was coming into later testing in the 1930s, it was going up against things which would become the Bren gun, for example. So really, really up against it from the start. However, I like to end on a positive note. So if one thing, this is a real testament to the perseverance of Mowbray Gore-Farquhar. We have an amazing bit of footage from him in 1933, still demonstrating these things, still giving them a go. And yeah, a real testament to the British guy in the shed. So we'll leave it with his personal perseverance, which I do find quite endearing. And thanks for joining me this week on What Is This Weapon? As ever, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. Please support the museum in any way you can, whether that's through donations, or even better, come visit us in the museum. We've got plenty of summer programmes on, there's plenty of gladiatorial things, a Roman festival we'd love to see you at. Or please feel free to try and visit our sister sites, so Fort Nelson down in Fareham, and also, of course, the Tower of London. We'd love to see you there as well. Thanks very much, and we'll catch you again next week.